Hello and welcome to our Ask the Author session on decarbonising India's transport system, charting the way forward. My name is Ronan Mackerley and I'm from the ITF Communications team, and I'm joined today by Pierpaolo Cazzola, who is ITF's advisor on energy, technology and environmental sustainability. So our Ask the Author session will last for about half an hour. We'll first have a presentation from Pierpaolo on the key findings of the report, and then we'll go to our Q&A session, our interactive session, where you can ask the expert, the lead author of the report, your questions on decarbonising India's transport system. The main housekeeping rule to bear in mind is to use the Zoom's Q&A function to send us your questions. Do not use the chat function, we cannot see that. So from now, you are free to send in your questions on our Q&A. And before we start, I'll just let you know that this report is part of our project on decarbonising transport in emerging economies, which looks at decarbonising transport in Argentina, Azerbaijan, India, and Morocco. And this is the follow-up event of a report that we issued 3 weeks ago in February. So there's a link in the chat to the report for you just now. And I'll hand over without further ado to Pierpaolo, who will present the report, and then we'll move to our Q&A session. Pierpaolo, over to you.
Hi, Ronan. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to walk you through a presentation on this report on decarbonising Indian transport system. So a little bit of context, as Ronan just mentioned, this report was launched at a workshop that we held on 24 February, and it's part of work that we do thanks to funding from the German International Climate Initiative and in the framework of 2 projects, Decarbonising Transport in Emerging Economies and NDC Transport Initiative for Asia. And I believe Ronan has sent links to the pages relevant for this. In terms of content, so what you'll find in this report is an analysis of current transport activity, energy use and CO2 emissions in India, a review of key policy instruments set up by Indian institutions to shape transport development, an investigation of future scenarios and key aspects that should be considered while looking at strategies for transport decarbonisation. And it includes a conclusive section on underlining the relevance of taking a life cycle approach when looking at emission reduction in transportation, given the developments that are happening now in different strategies that involve different ways to produce fuels and energy vectors. So when it comes to passenger transport in India, here we observe historically that there has been a significant increase in activity, more than tripling from 2005 to 2020, reaching over 6 trillion ppm, despite some uncertainties on the actual value. We may get into that, especially if there are questions. Cars are gaining relevance in terms of passenger kilometer share over the course of this time, but still the mix is very diverse in India. When it comes to freight transport, here you see only figures for inland transport on the graph. Well, truck accounts for the largest portion. Rail is though a key mode of freight transport in India, even if it experienced some degree of decline in terms of shares in recent years. And then in addition to what you see on screen, there's maritime transport, which is estimated between 2.5 and 3 trillion ton kilometers, so at a very large portion of the total freight activity, and that is due to the long distance in particular that international shipping requires. When it comes to energy use, the estimations we have for 2020 is 4.3 exajoules. It's about 20% of the final energy use. Most of the energy is actually used in transport comes from oil, and oil accounts for 95% of final energy use. And 60% goes to passenger, about 40% goes to freight. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions, we see that there's a close trend. The trend mirror closely those of energy, and that is due to the oil intensiveness of the sector. And also we observed that comparing greenhouse gas and energy with what we saw before, activities that the more energy intensive modes, namely air and road, all road modes account for greater shares of energy and greenhouse gas compared to what they did in terms of activity. That's due to the higher energy intensity. In terms of policy framework, there are a number of instruments that have been adopted in India to already by the government to manage the transition towards lower emissions. So some relate with climate policy, in particular National Action Plan on Climate Change, which dates back to 2009, but also NDC, which is from 2015. There are policies focused on infrastructure, for example, elements including in the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the Eastern and Western dedicated freight corridors, and regional rapid transit systems. There are policies related with energy efficiency belonging primarily to the National Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency. This includes standards for cars and heavy-duty vehicles in terms of CO2 emission standards, CO2 emission requirements. There are policies with a focus on urban transport. Some of them, like the National Urban Transport Policy Framework, dates back to 2006 and launched the Unified Metropolitan Transport Authorities. And then there are more recent policies on transit-oriented development and green urban mobility schemes. There are a number of policies also focusing on electric mobility. The inception point, if you want, is the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan of 2013, which was 2020 was the target at the time. There are policies including, in particular, the faster adoption and manufacturing of hybrid and EVs, or the FAME scheme, which has been recently upgraded and beefed up. There is also an element of public procurement that has been part of the national policy in India. In addition, there are three other pillars: low carbon fuels, low carbon electricity, and hydrogen. So India, in terms of fuels, has one of the highest fuel taxes amongst countries with similar income. It still subsidizes kerosene, though, and when it comes to aviation, it's a signatory of CORSIA, of the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme of ICAO, but it didn't yet sign up for the voluntary pilot phase. Recently, there were updates in the national biofuel policies with increasing targets for ethanol blending. In terms of low carbon electricity, so coal is currently the largest domestic source, but there are very important pledges in terms of shifting towards renewables, in particular solar, with expectations for them to be met due to the fact that solar PV installations are subject to a major upward dynamic. And finally, on hydrogen, there is a National Hydrogen Energy Roadmap dating back to 2006, identifying hydrogen as a raw material for industry, fertilizer, chemicals, and also opening up for possibility for using combustion engine and turbines. More recently, in February, there has been a proposal on a hydrogen mission with a focus on green hydrogen. So the importance of focusing on green hydrogen is evident due to the need to keep emissions low for an energy carrier that's subject to thermodynamic losses across the supply chain. So we also looked at future projections quickly. So we compared the work done by different analytical groups who also contributed to our workshop in February, outlining in more detail what I'm talking about now. So we observed that the passenger road transport in any scenario is expected to grow significantly, and also other transport modes are expected to grow in India. There are high ambition scenarios in terms of climate mitigation that tend to show lower projection for road, reflecting the fact that there are policy impacts on travel demand that are aimed essentially to manage activity and also for foster model shifts. Finally, we do see quite a bit of uncertainty, even for base data on passenger kilometers, and this is due to the need to do more work to figure out, especially in the case of buses, what are the reasonable benchmarks. It's difficult to match energy demand on one side and vehicle stock on the other with high mileages of buses. And this is a question for which we've been discussing with some partners and is still open and leads to a degree of uncertainty in the ranges. When it comes to freight, we see levels of road freight transport also expecting to grow significantly. This is the case for road, but also for freight rail and maritime freight. But even though the rate of growth is lower than road, there is less of a variability across different scenarios and in terms of ambition when it comes to the share of the overall level of activity in freight than we saw in the case of passenger. The implication for final energy demand is essentially pointing towards growth. So we see growing demand for transportation, and which leads to higher energy use and energy efficiency improvements that are more than offset by the increasing activity. And also, this is true in let's say conventional scenarios, new policy scenario that depicts what is already on the table or being discussed, and also in high ambition scenarios which account for greater ambition in terms of emission reduction. When it comes to ambition scenarios, what you see in the case of energy is that there is a greater variability in trends, with some groups pointing to a peak and others that don't. This is also true for CO2 emissions. So again, subject to rapid growth, but potentially having opportunities to peak between now and 2050 in the period between 2030 and 2040. Again, I went very quickly through what we did in the report. So what, broadly speaking, the key conclusions that we came to is the fact that further policy action is required to move towards greater greenhouse gas emission mitigation in a way that could align with the Paris Agreement. We understand well, so all these results I showed you is in particular on greenhouse gas emissions related with direct CO2 emissions, but we understand that the transition, no matter whether this comes through a role for fossil energy with carbon capture or renewable energy, this will require greater a better accounting of emissions that are related with transport, but don't necessarily happen in terms of direct emissions. They are related with the way the fuels are produced, the vehicles are produced. So they are coming from different components once we take a life cycle perspective. So we expect upstream emissions to represent a growing share of future emissions in transport, and we have seen that other major economies like the EU and the United States have already started to deploy policy tools that account for these elements when thinking about transport decarbonization. So we think it's important, and as things move forward, India also develops policies that take these into account. And this project is this scoping paper is in sort of kickoff tool for us for projects that have next steps, and we expect indeed to develop in the direction of strengthening the capacity of India to take a life cycle assessment approach when thinking about its future transport decarbonization strategy. So here you have a quick list of next step with a legend that essentially associates them to the two projects, but shown in a single work stream. And this means developing an assessment tool, publishing results related with this assessment tool, and then strengthening capacity, local capacity to use these and develop policies that take this aspect into account. So that is, in a nutshell, what we have done with this project. I apologize if I rushed through, but we only have 10 minutes to try to give you a sense of what the report is about. You'll find definitely more in the report, and I believe that Ronan can share a page, a link to the web page where you can find it. Thank you very much. I hope I will be eager to take this forward with questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Pierpaolo, for a very comprehensive overview of what is indeed a very complex project. The links that Pierpaolo referred to are already in the chat function. You can access both of those report pages directly, and we'll send you a link a little later on to subscribe to the updates as the project moves forward. So it's time for your questions and answers. You're already sending in questions. Thank you very much. Please again use the Q&A function of Zoom to send us your questions. To kick us off, we'll start with a question from Eddie Van Bowel, who asks, what do you think the main driver for change in transport energy sources in India will be? For the climate policy or urban air quality? Clearly a big question in India.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Eddie. So I do think that there will be a strong element, a strong role played by urban air quality, which is perceived as a clear issue and maybe closer to the individuals that live in cities in India and who are more directly exposed to the consequences of poor air quality. And so my understanding is that this is an important element that will influence the development of policy in India. Still, I don't think it's going to be, so the consequence of this, in my opinion, is that there will be a need to align policies that meet the ambition of improving local air quality with policies that deliver on setting India on a path towards a lower carbon intensity for the transport sector. So it's going to be important to try to find win-win solutions that address both challenges, the climate challenge and the air quality challenge. Let me also add that it's very clear that other policy priorities are extremely important in India, and they are related with the economic and social development. So it's actually the win-win that needs to find a solution on these three directions, not just air quality and climate, but also economic and social development.
Okay, thanks, Pierpaolo. Let's delve into the numbers and the scenario modeling with two questions. One from Amit Agrawal, who asks about on the passenger transport level, if there's a large split between the urban and the rural passenger transport levels, and whether the intra-urban travel is closer to the global benchmarks of about 10 trillion, or closer to what should be India's national benchmark, which is half that at about 5 trillion.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you repeat?
I think the question is looking to understand the split between the urban and rural in passenger transport. We give an overall figure for passenger transport. And Amit is wondering if our scenario is going more towards developed country benchmarks, which bring it up to about 10 trillion, or closer to India's national benchmark, which would be about half that.
So again, I'm not sure I get this, but yeah, indeed, there is a split between urban and non-urban activities. So in the case of urban, the model mix is more focused on two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and with contributions from urban rail, which are especially in the form of suburban rail networks, and then from buses. Buses are also, and rail also occupy a significant portion of inter-urban transport. As things move forward, we do see a transition, which is what has accompanied every country going through the levels of development that we expect for India. We do see a transition towards greater reliance on cars, and this is true for both urban and non-urban travel. The opportunity that exists for urban mobility is to ensure that urban development takes place in a way that includes the development of transit and maintains then urban densities and the provision of transit. Well, the quality of the provision of transit increases the quality of the provision of transit, so that it maintains a significant share of these modes and avoids a deep transition towards cars. I must say, so my expectation is that there will be a role of policy that will influence the extent to which there will be a transition towards personal mobility, and that has strong implications for energy and greenhouse gas emissions. That is as far as urban mobility is concerned. When it comes to non-urban mobility, I believe that there will be a stronger reliance on personal vehicles, but also that given that India has a unique rail network for its level of development globally, for its level of income globally, I also believe that there's a big opportunity to ensure that rail will continue to play a significant role in terms of intercity movements in India. And that's fairly unique, in my opinion, across the world for countries that have a similar, as I say, level of income in India, because it's because of the unique extent of the development of the Indian rail network. I hope this goes in the direction. I'm not sure I really got the details of the questions. I'm sorry. Eventually, we can follow up on an email.
Sure, we can come back to that, no problem. And as Amit points out, it's not trillions, it's per capita passenger kilometers, but we can come back with more detail subsequently by email. There's also a question in about the estimates for freight transport having a very wide range, the estimates for 2050. The person is wondering, is there an issue with the estimates and why is there such uncertainty?
Okay, I think the point on the uncertainty and the range of the estimates is important. There are uncertainties can be driven by different aspects. One of them is the extent to which we understand what is the current picture and the current size of the passenger activity and freight activity. Inevitably, in a country like India, there are data challenges, and that is what explains a different starting point for different modeling exercises. And so I think there's an effort that is required to try to converge towards a single estimate. I believe there are good reasons for people that have estimates of especially passenger activity above what we reported, and also good reasons for us to stick to what we showed. Our approach is primarily focused on data that come from hard and physical quantities like vehicle stocks and sales of fuels, and is trying to ensure that there is a rational relationship between these. Others have a stronger reliance on purely transport-related parameters, and they tend to end up with higher estimates. This is true for freight and it's true for passenger. The second aspect is the fact that some of the scenarios that we showed are pre-COVID and others are post-COVID. So that evidently has impact on GDP growth in particular. And so that also explains some of the range of the variability. So the combination of those two leads to these ranges. I think, as I said, more work is needed to try to narrow those. And this is important work because those ranges have enormous energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions implications. But I would be lying if I said that we have an exact picture of what is all the range of parameters that characterizes transport, energy, and greenhouse gases with a high level of accuracy in India. I think my call is really for increasing capacity on narrowing the gap between the range of historical series.
Okay.
Estimates.
Okay, thanks, Pierpaolo. We have many questions coming in. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Leona Nunes asks, is there any indication of the two-wheeler influx into the last mile of urban delivery goods with the rise of the gig economy and online platform-based work?
Can you repeat? Is there any
indication of a large influx in two-wheelers for the last mile delivery part of freight transport?
Okay, well, my understanding is I don't have a direct answer to the question specifically. What I understand is that two-wheelers, three-wheelers are an extremely important part of the mobility, so passenger and freight mobility, especially passenger in India. I wouldn't be surprised if their role in a context where you have a growth deliveries would increase on the freight side. So I think it's conceivable to imagine, especially in the next decade, an increase of reliance on 2-3-wheelers for freight deliveries. And I must say also, given that we're talking about vehicles that are highly utilized, given the policy developments that exist in India and the ambition to transition towards e-mobility, and the fact that e-mobility is more likely to succeed on light vehicles, I think this may also be a driver of electrification in the context of India.
Okay. Another question on electrification from Brendan Finn, who talks about, as we move to electrification, we reduce emissions at the point of use, certainly, but we only, of course, reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions if the grid itself is low carbon. Can you shed some light on electricity generation in India?
Yes, indeed. I agree that it's important to bring down emissions in terms of carbon intensity of per kilowatt hour. This is especially true in a country like India that has lots of light vehicles, since the energy efficiency gap that exists between combustion engines and electric vehicles is smaller in light vehicles than in comparison with larger vehicles. So that essentially puts increased pressure on the need to decarbonize the power sector. One advantage of the light vehicles is that they can be effectively integrated without without becoming a liability for the power for the electricity distribution network, but rather becoming an asset. So it's important that there will be policies that will help going in that direction. And then it's also important that power gets decarbonized. And as I mentioned quickly, my understanding is that India has major pledges in terms of scaling up solar electricity, and really big opportunities to ensure that future developments will focus more on renewables and renewable electricity, rather than fossil and coal in particular. So in that sense, I believe that the way forward is very encouraging, and there is a good logic in trying to move towards electrification for transport decarbonization, given that the context on the power generation is set to change. That's my read of what I understood.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierpaolo. Before we take the next question, we're going to launch a very quick poll. Onda, if you could launch the polling now, just to check that we are providing you a format that's interesting. Please respond to 2 very quick questions if possible. And back to your questions. One in on the governance side of things. Simon Reed asks, can decarbonisation be achieved in India bus usage without a major change in the contracting of bus services? And will this be the end of the one-man owned or operated bus company?
Well, I understand that the electrification of buses is a capital-intensive business. So you basically need to transition towards buses that are more expensive. You need to ensure that you have adequate charging infrastructure, and in this case, we're not talking about we're talking about power that is at least 50 kilowatt. So I would expect that due to this, the nature of the more capital intensive, the one-man type of bus model may need to transition towards something which is more centralized, and in which, because the one-man model is essentially more capital constrained than the model that is based on companies operating buses in a given urban environment. So I understand there has been experiences, especially in Latin America, on a transition between more informal public transport towards more centralized systems. This is a difficult transition, but I believe that, as I say, due to the capital intensiveness of the transition towards electrified buses or electric buses, it may be necessary to think about that sort of transition towards a more centralized type of approach to public transport.
Okay, thank you. Ashutosh Jha asks around the discussion of the HDV, the heavy duty truck norms for truck and buses. There were dates around 2022. Do you have any further information on this transition to new norms for trucks and buses?
So I think, does this relate with e-mobility again, or it's more general? This is for fuel economy standards.
A general question on the norms.
Okay, I suppose there are different aspects, different reads I can give to this. One is related with the fuel economy standards. The other one is the technical regulation that are enabler of a transition towards, let's say, electric or hydrogen-based systems. When it comes to fuel economy standards, yeah, there is a need to develop further than 2022 the regulatory framework, as far as I understand. There's also a need to understand how electric vehicles can be integrated. When it comes to technical feasibility, so the technical standards, the conditions are different for buses, which typically can rely on let's say systems of charging which are already standardized and typically relate with chargers that have a 50 kilowatt power, and the story is different for trucks, which may actually rely on, or we may need to rely on heavier, on higher power chargers, if they are heavy trucks. Light trucks are in a similar, so light commercial vehicles are in a similar framework as well as cars in that respect. And I also would expect that the regulatory framework on fuel economy would, in a way, integrate them with what happens on cars. Let me add that if we talk about fuel economy standards, in the case of India, it would be very important also to look at two-wheelers, given the sheer size of the two-wheeler stock. And at the moment, this is not regulated. There's interest in moving in that direction, and I would like to flag the importance of also taking action in that front on energy efficiency.
Thanks, Pierpaolo. We're coming to the end of our session. I just wanted to cover something else that was raised in a question, which is the desire to look at transport from what you call a life cycle perspective. Why is that particularly interesting in India's case?
Okay, well, part of the reason is what we discussed earlier in terms of carbon intensity of electricity generation and the need to ensure that that goes down to deliver on transport. Okay, that sort of problem, it's even stronger if you think about transition to other alternative fuels, and I'm thinking of hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels that really require making sure that the production pathways are extremely low carbon, to ensure that you have an effective way to decarbonize transport, if that is what you want to use. And the complexity of the pathways that can actually lead you to these alternative fuels is growing, with the growing opportunities for scaling up hydrogen production and then use of hydrogen for making different types of fuels and integrating it also with biogenic carbon resources eventually. So all this to say, I think these are areas. I mean, the same can be said about natural gas, which is already part of the transport mix in India because of three-wheelers and buses. So that again, it's something that can lead to emissions of methane during the operation, but also upstream. Methane is a greenhouse gas. So ensuring that there's a good understanding of what happens in terms of changing the energy mix powering transport, not only in terms of what happens at the tailpipe, but also in upstream, and is going to be something that, given the tendency to transition technologies that will happen in next decades, will gain relevance. That's our read, at least, and that is why we think there's an important. It is important to ensure that there's greater capacity to handle this type of change from a policy side.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Pierpaolo. We'll wrap it up there. We went a little bit over time, but we managed to cover many of your questions. Those that we didn't, we will endeavor to reply to you directly via email. And I see a few of our participants have given their email address to that effect in the chat. So thank you for that. You'll also see in the chat a link to subscribe to ITF products. This will inform you about the project updates and outputs going forward. So I'll just finish by thanking very much Pierpaolo Cazzola and on the technical side, and look forward to seeing you for our next Ask the Author. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.